Hi, Bree Stensrud, and this video segment is about explaining U.S. asylum policy. And we're going to be talking with Matthew Soerens, who is the U.S. Director of Church Mobilization and Advocacy. If you're in our Women of Welcome community, you know that we reference Matt a lot because he's knee-deep in this work, and he's a reliable and trusted source. So he's probably one of the only men that we continue to welcome into our community of just women. So welcome, Matt.
Hey, Bree, it's good to see you.
Good to see you too. Okay, so what is asylum? I'm going to pepper you with some questions, but let's start there. What is asylum?
Yeah, so asylum, to understand asylum, you've got to understand a little bit of history. So if you go back to the era really right before World War II, we had people who were fleeing the Nazis and the precursors of the Nazi regime in Germany. Jewish people who were going throughout Europe, and also some who sought to come to the United States. And some of them were able to come to the United States, but others of them were turned away because they didn't fit into the immigration policy categories that the United States government had at that time. So in the days after World War II, many nations around the world came together and basically said, we should never do that again. If someone shows up at our country and they're in danger and sending them back would lead to them being persecuted or even killed, we should not do that. So we will commit, and the United States eventually committed to this, along with many other countries around the world, to say we will not send someone back if they have a credible fear of persecution, specifically on account of their race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or social group. So asylum is when someone comes to the United States. You cannot request asylum overseas in the United States. That's more the refugee resettlement process. But to request asylum, you've got to get to the U.S., and then the burden of proof is on the asylum seeker to demonstrate that they indeed have a credible fear, that it is on account of one of those 5 reasons, and that they otherwise qualify under U.S. law. But that's basically what asylum is. It's saying we will be a safe place for you, and we won't send you back.
Okay, so if someone wants to seek asylum in the United States, what does that process look like?
Yeah, so it'll depend in many ways on the circumstance that they're fleeing and what their opportunities are. So probably the easiest way to seek asylum is to get on an airplane and fly to the United States. And once you're here, present what's called an affirmative application for asylum. But that is only possible if you have some sort of a visa to get you onto the airplane and into the United States to begin with. So, for example, if you're a fairly wealthy person or coming from a country where you have a good amount of resources, it's fairly easy to get a tourist visa to come to the United States. Or maybe you were able to get a student visa to come and do a master's program or an undergraduate program in the United States. So that's one way that asylum works. There's a lot of other people who would be unlikely to ever be granted a tourist visa or any kind of visa. So they don't have the option to just buy a plane ticket and come to the US. So then your only option is to get to the border. And in most cases, that means either it's people who live in the Western Hemisphere, in Latin America, or who can somehow fly to somewhere in Central or South America and make their way up to the U.S.-Mexico border. And once you get to the border, you are allowed under U.S. law to request asylum. And you can do so. The law actually, you can go up to the port of entry. That is to say, sort of the bridge where if any of us have ever crossed between Mexico and the United States by land, for those of us who are U.S. citizens, we go up, we show our U.S. passport, and we're in. For asylum seekers, they go up, they say, do you have your visa? They say, I don't have a visa, but I have a credible fear of persecution on account of, let's say, my religion. And that begins a process where that person, basically our government, will determine, do you indeed qualify for asylum under U.S. law? And it's also important to note the law actually explicitly says that you can request asylum whether you entered the country lawfully at that port of entry or you entered unlawfully. So if you cross the border without a visa, when the Border Patrol apprehends you, you're also allowed to request asylum at that point. And in fact, we'll go over border security, I think, in a separate video. But one of the big shifts we've seen in recent years is a lot of people who are crossing the border unlawfully are not trying to evade the Border Patrol. They're trying to find the Border Patrol so that they can present their asylum request. And some of that is because we've made it more difficult in recent years to present asylum at the port of entry.
So that's a really interesting thing to note, is that you may cross the border illegally without a visa or without proper documentation and then claim asylum, say I want to apply for that, right? So seeking asylum in the US, crossing the border illegally, is actually part of the legal way to seek asylum in the US. So that makes it a little sticky, doesn't it?
It's complicated because people will say, well, is this a legal process? It is legal to request asylum. The law is quite clear on that. And even no matter how you entered, That doesn't mean that the entry itself was necessarily lawful. And you might still be liable for what's usually a misdemeanor offense for unlawful entry into the country. But you still have the right to request asylum under U.S. law. And in most cases, and this has been a point of controversy in recent years, just because something is unlawful doesn't mean the government has to prosecute you. Most of us have sped on the highway at some point and been given a warning at some point or another. The police officer could have given me a ticket, but in his discretion decided on this case I'm not going to, because you were only a few miles over, or because, I don't know, he was having a good day, or I impressed him with my charm, or I don't know what. But the same is true with federal law enforcement at the border. You could charge someone for misdemeanor offense for crossing the border unlawfully, but the normal practice in most administrations has been not to do so when they are indeed there to request asylum. And there's no reason to think that it's a totally frivolous asylum application, but they pass what's called a credible fear interview, where it's credible that you might win your case. That's the first step. But they kind of weed out cases that they think, there's no chance this person actually has a credible fear of persecution. If I'm coming from, I don't know, Canada, and say they're persecuting me in Canada for being white, well, that's just on its face is not credible, because most people in Canada are white and seem to be just fine. But if I'm an Iraqi Christian and I say they're persecuting me in Iraq because of my Christian faith, that's probably credible. And likewise, with some of the violence we've seen in Central America, someone who would say, they've threatened my life in Central America, that's probably likely to meet that minimal credibility threshold if you have at least some evidence that that is indeed the case, because a lot of people are threatened in Central America, especially El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras.
Okay, so there's a couple things you brought up that I want to just take a deeper dive onto. But I think it's probably important to note and remind folks that it's not that you can request asylum at a U.S. embassy in your own country, right? But then you have, and a lot of people will think, mostly when we're talking about people who are seeking asylum, I think in recent years there's been a lot of headlines of people coming from Central and South America. And so then you think, well, they should just apply in their home country. Can't they just do that at a U.S. embassy? And yet you have people that are across the pond, that are applying to seek asylum in the U.S. and they're doing that in their home country. So can you help us understand, that part of that is like refugee resettlement, part of that is seeking asylum. Help us kind of separate and understand that a bit.
Yeah, so the U.S. law here in both the case of refugees and asylum seekers is the Refugee Act of 1980. But the big distinction is you cannot request asylum unless you are in or at the border of the United States, or the port of entry, which could be an airport as well. So if you're in, let's say, Honduras, you cannot request asylum in the United States at the U.S. Embassy in Tegucigalpa. Now, it might be possible to request refugee status. And although in most cases, there's a few exceptions on an individual country basis, but in most cases, to be considered a refugee, you have to already be outside of your country. So if you're Salvadoran and you fled to Honduras, you might be able to request refugee status there. Or more often, it's having fled to Costa Rica, which is generally considered a safer country in the region. So one of the things that is, I think, a good solution to the challenge of a lot of Central American asylum seekers is actually to increase refugee resettlement from Central America, where people could go have an opportunity to be screened nearer to home, whether in their own country with a special exception or in a neighboring country. And if they indeed qualify as a refugee, meaning they meet that same definition, having fled a credible fear of persecution for their race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or social group, then they would go through the U.S. refugee resettlement process, which means you get on an airplane and you land in a place like where near I live in Chicago, and an organization, usually a faith-based organization like World Relief, is there at the airport to meet you. And it's a very orderly process. But it's also important to understand that it is a process that is open to a very small percentage of the people in the world who have fled persecution. I mean, the best estimates are there's about 26 million refugees in the world. And refugee resettlement numbers are in flux right now. But in recent years, the number of arrivals in a given year have been 10, 12,000. So it's a very, very, very small share of the world's refugees who qualify for resettlement to the United States, or frankly, to any country, to Canada, Australia, to Europe. And the effect, the fewer opportunities there are for that hope of resettlement, the more pressure there is to make your own way to a safe country and request asylum. And I think that's a significant factor in where we see such a big spike in the last several years in the number of asylum seekers, especially from Central America. I mean, there's people who are desperate in parts of Africa or the Middle East, but in most cases, they don't have the option to get to the United States to request asylum. They can't get on an airplane. They can't swim to the United States. But if you're in the Western Hemisphere, it might be an option. And we do see people. I mean, I've met Cameroonians who were able to get, and these are usually some, maybe better off Cameroonians who were able to get a visa to fly to South America, have traveled all the way up through most of the Western Hemisphere to get to the U.S.-Mexico border to request asylum because they're part of a persecuted minority group in Cameroon. So we do see some of that. But for the most people, if you have to cross the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean, that's not possible. So it's mostly people from the Western Hemisphere we see making the trip by land.
Okay, Matt, so you gave us a lot of information there. I guess what I'm trying to understand is really what's the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker? And really, who can apply for what in their country?
Sure. So a refugee is someone who has fled their country of origin because of a well-founded fear of persecution on account of their race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or social group. And that's both the U.S. legal definition and the definition used internationally by most countries. An asylum seeker is someone who reaches a second country or a third country, a country that is not their own, and claims to meet the definition of a refugee. But until some government has made that verification that indeed their fear is credible, that it is based on one of those reasons under the law, and there may be other disqualifying factors, you've been a serious criminal or certain other things. Until some government authority has made that determination, you're not an asylee, which is what we call someone in the U.S. when you're granted asylum. You're an asylum seeker. And historically, it varies year to year, and it varies in some ways because of new policies and changes of the law, but in terms of how the law has been interpreted. But somewhere between 25 and 60% of asylum seekers win their cases in the U.S. in recent history. And that's a pretty wide variance, again, because we've seen some real changes in the last few years that have, in general, meant that fewer people are winning their asylum requests than previously.
So a refugee versus an asylee is really just based on your location.
All about location and about who is ready to make the determination if you indeed qualify. So most of the people globally who we can say are refugees, it's because the United Nations has made that determination. When the U.S. considers someone for resettlement, which again is far fewer than 0.5% of the world's refugees who even get considered in most years, the U.S. does their own verification that you indeed meet the qualification. They'll take a referral from the UN in many cases, but our government, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of State, does interviews overseas to verify that this person indeed has a credible fear of persecution on account of one of these reasons under the law. And also they haven't persecuted others, they haven't committed other crimes that would be disqualifying.
Okay, so if someone is presenting, let's take out kind of the global view and we'll talk about the southern border. If I'm presenting at the border and I'm saying, and I've seen this, I've watched this video with you where families will come to the border and they will sit and they'll wait or they'll look for cameras so that they can be seen and identified by Border Patrol because they are looking for them to then claim that asylum case. What happens? So I show up at the border, I'm meeting with a Border Patrol agent, and this is also very different than showing up at a port of entry, which is what we traditionally have asked people to do, is if you're going to claim asylum or seek asylum, you show up at a legal port of entry. And I want you to talk about the legal ports of entry as well. So when I show up at the border, there's two ways of showing up, right? Showing up right at the border, anywhere in between ports of entry, and then there's showing up at a port of entry. Talk to us about those two avenues and what that process looks like.
Sure. I think the obvious preferable process would be to show up at that port of entry. It's very, should be an orderly process. You walk up and say, I'm here to request asylum. And here's, my story. Here's the evidence. You get kind of a preliminary screening. Again, that's called a credible fear interview. And from there, if you pass that credible fear interview, what would normally happen is you'd be brought into the United States, usually held in the detention facility. And how long you're in that facility will depend. Generally, family units, like we've got a bunch of little kids, they won't hold them for very long, although in some cases that does happen and has happened. Obviously, we're aware that in some cases kids have been separated from parents at different points. But adults are often held for longer periods of time, and that's true under various administrations. Eventually, you're either released into the United States and wait for your court date, usually with an ankle bracelet on adults to make sure that if they don't show up for court, the federal government can go find them and remove them from the country, or you're held in detention until your court date. And one of the challenges is our immigration system is so backlogged in recent years that you could wait literally years before your court date. That's what the kind of historical norm process has been. what we've seen, and that was true whether you entered at a port of entry, frankly, or whether you were detained crossing the border. You could be detained in either case. One of the changes we saw in the last administration, and actually this started under the Obama administration in 2016 on a very small scale, but was expanded significantly under the Trump administration, was for people who requested asylum at the port of entry, so at that bridge from Mexico to the United States, a process called metering. And the idea of metering was, instead of being told, sure, we'll start this process, you'd basically be told to go and wait your turn in line. And it was a very strange, kind of ambiguous process. Literally, there was someone on the Mexican side of the border, and apparently kind of governed by the Mexican government, or a nonprofit, very informal, who would have a notebook that would give you a number and say, your number 1,455, probably take 2 to 3, 5 to 6 months before we're calling your number. And every morning, I've seen this in Tijuana, it happened in other parts of the Mexican border as well. They would call a few numbers. Sometimes no one would get called in a given day. Sometimes, several people would get called. But the backlogs there to enter through that lawful process became so long. And my view, and I've talked to Border Patrol agents who have, been frustrated by this process because they feel the same way, is it effectively funneled people to go across unlawfully, where they also had the lawful opportunity to request asylum. Again, the crossing was unlawful, but the asylum request is legal, no matter how you cross. So in many ways, people got funneled out into the desert, which is also, of course, a more dangerous way to cross into the United States, especially when you've got kids involved.
Right. So, and how many legal ports of entry? I mean, a lot of people will say they should just go to a legal port of entry. I mean, how many are there along the border?
Gosh, that's, I don't remember exactly how many. It's not that many. Obviously we're talking about California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. I don't want to guess a number because I'll probably be off, but it's not that many. And the important thing to understand is, again, it's not as easy as going up to the port of entry and saying, I'd like to request asylum, because I've met people who were told to wait a year in a fairly, some of the border towns in Mexico are some of the least safe parts of Mexico, especially for vulnerable families who don't have resources and don't have a place to stay. I will say there are amazing people in Mexico, churches in particular, who are just incredibly doing all they can to care for people. And this was happening when the metering process began. It happened in an even larger scale when the U.S. government, a few years ago under the Trump administration, began a new policy called Remain in Mexico, where instead of being turned over to the U.S., either to wait for your court hearing, families were turned back to Mexico. And there's still people, as we're recording this, that policy is being reviewed. But as we're recording this, there's still people in that backlog in Mexico. And many of them have been literally sleeping on the pew of a church for months and months. And I mean, I've been in churches that are hosting dozens of people, and usually they've eventually built beds somewhere. I was in one church near Tijuana where the pastor had given up his office to have more space to build bunk beds. And they are hosting often Central American families, sometimes Cameroonian or Haitian from other parts of the world who made their way to Mexico. And they're doing so because they think that's what Jesus would have them to do. But it was sobering to me as an American Christian. I've been there with pastors from the U.S. who think, wow, it never occurred to me to give up my office to, provide hope and help to someone who is in desperate need. But a lot of these folks, there's not enough churches doing that to cover all the need. And there's people basically living in kind of tent-like refugee camps along different parts of the Mexican border. And that is a situation I think, I'm hopeful will get addressed. That policy has been canceled at this point, and that no new people are being put into that program to be returned to Mexico. But also, as we're recording this, and again, things will change because of the coronavirus and the pandemic, the U.S. is not taking any new asylum cases right now under something called Title 42. They basically said, for public health reasons, we're just closed for asylum. So U.S. law says you can request asylum, since we won't turn you away. That's temporarily on hold. And that's been temporarily on hold for nearly a year now as we're recording this. And, it's unclear how the new Biden administration is going to respond to that. But at the moment, they have kept in place the policy that the Trump administration put in place in response to COVID.
Okay, so you talked a lot about this credible fear interview. What does a credible fear interview look like?
Yeah, so you've got trained officers of the U.S. government who are incredibly well trained. I think that's really important for people to understand. These are people who know the country conditions of the places that people are likely to be coming from. They know how to spot a lie. And they're looking for, is it are they going to be sort of a minimal threshold? Again, later you have to prove before a judge a much higher threshold of credibility that this is, you have a very serious reason to be afraid to go back to your country of origin. This isn't just in your imagination. This isn't you trying to work the system. They're going to have a very high standard for that before the judge. But the initial credible fear interview is looking at more of a basic, let's get rid of any cases that might really have no chance of winning. But we don't want to accidentally send someone back who could actually be harmed or killed. And that's really the purpose of the credible fear interview, is sort of make that discernment between a possible case, not a strong case necessarily, but a possible case, because we want the bias to be on the side of protecting human life, and an impossible case. You clearly either don't understand what asylum is, or you're lying, or you don't qualify for asylum. That doesn't mean you don't have a sympathetic case. I think it's important to acknowledge there are lots of people fleeing extreme poverty, and I'm very sympathetic to that dynamic. I wish that actually the U.S. would take more people from situations of poverty from Central America, but they don't qualify for asylum if that's the only reason they're fleeing, if it's not about persecution of some form. And I think, again, one of the solutions to that, because the reality is it's a mixed bag. There are people who absolutely should qualify for asylum who come from Central America. I've met many of them. There are people who, frankly, have no case for asylum who come from Central America, but they have very sympathetic stories, and I might flee and hope the United States would help me if I was in their case as well. And they probably have no understanding of how U.S. immigration law works, because, frankly, most Americans have no idea how immigration law works in this country, and this isn't a foreign language to them. So one thing I would love to see is more lawful immigrant visas available, again, back at that embassy for a temporary worker program or a permanent worker program when there are economic needs in the United States that these folks would be thrilled to fill. It's irrational to me that that is not a possibility in most cases. And by the way, that's part of why we've seen, a big drop overall in the number of unlawful entrants coming from Mexico, because we have a better temporary work program from Mexico that's been in place for a number of years now. We could extend that to Central Americans from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, and people who are fleeing an economic situation, not persecution threatening their lives, would be thrilled to go to the embassy, apply for a visa, and come on an airplane or even a bus or whatever. But that option is not available to the vast majority of those folks.
Okay, so this is one kind of narrative that I think people are a bit afraid of, and that is those who are seeking asylum, most of them are making false claims. And you're not necessarily, you've kind of said time and again, like, I'm not worried about those people getting weeded out. Like, tell us a little bit about why that shouldn't be a fear in people's minds because it's just a very high standard to meet in order to qualify, right?
Yeah, I mean, this evidence, the burden of proof, evidence in terms of evidence, is on the asylum seeker. And frankly, that's really difficult. I mean, I had a roommate for a number of years from Africa on a student visa. So he was, in a lawful status, but I genuinely think he had a credible fear of persecution in his country. Because I prayed with him, many nights, and he was praying for him, for his family back there. His father was imprisoned for reasons that were not legitimate. I do not doubt for a second the credibility of his fear, but he lost his asylum case because he didn't have documentary evidence of that fear. And fortunately, in his case, he still had a student visa. He did a second master's program, or started a second master's program to try to stay lawfully in the country because he was so afraid of going back. Eventually, he fell in love with a woman who happened to be an American citizen, and he was able to stay through his marriage, which was a very legitimate marriage. They have lovely children now as well. But, he's an example. I don't think his fear was not credible, but I do think he didn't have a strong case because the people whom he was afraid might harm him in his country of origin hadn't sent him a notarized letter saying, we're going to harm you, and it will be on account of your political opinion or your social group or your religion. And that's true for others as well. I mean, most people, it's hard to actually have the evidence to prove your case. And it's also just very, very subjective. I think it's really important to acknowledge. I mean, if you look at the approval rates for asylum from one asylum officer or one immigration judge to another, they vary dramatically. Like, even from one location to another. The asylum court in Atlanta, for example, approves almost no asylum applications. And that's been true for many years. That's not a new administration issue. For years, immigration attorneys will tell you, I don't know that I'd bother filing an asylum case if you happen to be in Georgia because the asylum courts there, the immigration courts, have such the reputation for approving so few cases, even cases that would be very likely to win if, for example, you were applying in New York. And that's not, they're working under the exact same law, but different human beings interpreting the same law in very different ways. And that's not equal justice under the law, which is one of the values that I think both as Americans, but even more so as Christians, we should be hoping for.
Right. Okay. So I have two more questions and then we're going to just wrap up. But one of them is, the refugee resettlement process. That's a little bit different. Can you talk to us about what that process is? What does that look like?
Sure. So refugee resettlement means someone has fled their country. They have sought temporary asylum in a neighboring country. So maybe it's Syrians going to Jordan, or South Sudanese going to Uganda, or Burmese going to Malaysia, or various other countries, Thailand. And that second country has said, we'll let you stay here for the moment. We're not necessarily going to give you work authorization. They usually do not. They often will say, you're stuck in this camp that you can't leave. So it's a refugee camp setting. And you're in a temporary status that sometimes stretches on for literally decades, where you're not allowed to work, but you can get some sort of a charitable handout, and that is your existence. So refugee resettlement is when the US or Canada or any other country says, we think that those people actually deserve a new life, and we could actually use them here in our country. So, and they particularly will use this for the most vulnerable cases. So maybe people who, even in that second country, are facing some element of persecution, maybe because of their faith as a Christian or as a Muslim, or whatever the faith is, it's getting them in trouble. Or where there's a health issue that, if you could go to the United States, we've got a children's hospital that could keep this child alive, but that does not exist in this refugee camp. Or maybe it's family reunification. So if you have a cousin in Colorado, but you're all alone in this refugee camp, the US might consider you for resettlement because of that possibility of family reunification. So refugee resettlement is the last resort. It happens for less than 1% of the world's refugees. But the US historically will take, the norm is somewhere, since the 1980 Refugee Act, the refugee ceiling, the maximum number for refugees has been set around 95,000. In the last several years, it's been significantly lower than that. And then we're hearing from the new administration that will be going slightly above that in the next several years, or at least that's the plan. Although not historically high, because if you go back to when the Refugee Act was signed, the refugee ceiling was set at above 230,000. So we actually have a lot of capacity in this country to welcome and integrate refugees into the community. And they go through, by the way, an incredibly thorough vetting process overseas before they ever get onto that airplane. The Heritage Foundation and others have said it's the most thorough vetting that the U.S. government has for any category of immigrant or visitor coming into the United States.
So Matt, talk to us a little bit about the vetting process, because I think the vetting process is a little different at the southern border versus if you're overseas and looking to come over. So talk to us about the security of that.
Yeah. Well, rightly, the U.S. government prioritizes the security of American citizens. So we have very thorough vetting processes in place, either for anyone being considered for asylum or being considered for refugee resettlement. And I think, as I said, the refugee resettlement process is incredibly thorough before you ever get on an airplane. And it usually involves about an 18-month process, multiple agencies of the U.S. government. And again, this is after being referred by the United Nations in many cases, who did their own process. But the U.S. doesn't just take the UN's word. We duplicate that process with our own officers of the U.S. government, various background checks. And then those people, once they clear every step, and not just public safety concerns, but also health concerns. So there's a public health check. Now with COVID, people have to have a negative COVID test basically right before they get on the plane as well, and then they have to quarantine. It's a very thorough process. And by the way, an incredibly effective process. There's been 3 million refugees resettled to the United States since 1980, and not a single one of those individuals has taken the life of an American citizen in a terrorist attack in the United States, which is, again, really remarkable. Now for asylum, again, these are people who didn't come invited by the United States. We couldn't do a very thorough vetting process before they showed up. And yet, for good humanitarian, and I think reasons driven by our biblical faith, we also don't want to just send someone back and say, go wait in a dangerous place while we do an 18-month vetting process. So what happens in that case is there's still a very thorough vetting that happens. They'll check any sort of concern for criminal issues. If there's ever a reason that we think this person could be a public safety threat, they'll remain in detention until their court hearing. It's people who there's no reason to think that there's any public safety threat. And again, I think it's important for people to just have a picture. Most of these are families with little kids. Most of them are Christians coming from Central America. These are countries that are largely pretty evenly split between Catholics and evangelical Christians, but those are the dominant religious groups. I have been with asylum seekers at the U.S.-Mexican border who I've offered to pray for, and they have turned around and offered to pray for me. And I mean, I've been in churches that have all-night prayer vigils along the border, praying for, the situation in the United States as it relates to asylum. So these are often brothers and sisters in Christ. But that's basically the vetting process. And, I have a lot of confidence in it. Our role as Christians is to love and welcome people, whether or not it's totally safe. It wasn't totally safe for the Good Samaritan to stop and help someone beaten on the side of the road. But the data suggests that welcoming refugees and other immigrants, regardless of their status, is in no way any more of a threat to me than any native-born U.S. citizen in terms of crime rates or things like that.
So if you present at the border, and you want to seek asylum, you go through a credible fear test, and then once you pass that, then what happens?
Well, different things could happen. You might be put in detention for a really long time, months, even years, until your court hearing, or you might be released and allowed to basically usually go live with your family, because most of these people have some relative or a family friend, or sometimes it's a church or a nonprofit that will help take care of them until their court date. They're not authorized to work for at least the first several months that they're in the country. So it does put them in kind of a catch-22. You can't work, you can't provide for yourself lawfully. You also can't get any sort of public assistance in most cases. So you're relying on some private charitable help, or you're working unlawfully, which happens sometimes because people have to pay rent and that sort of thing. But the interesting thing is it's a much more fiscally conservative opportunity for the American taxpayer, because it's incredibly expensive to detain people whom we have no reason to think pose any sort of public safety threat, instead of letting them basically rely on their family to take care of them until they can go to court.
Because we've evaluated that, done background checks and whatnot before we've allowed them to come into the country, and then allowed them to go live with a sponsor family or an NGO or something like that, right?
Well, sometimes we hear, well, and then those people will never show up for court. Occasionally, there are people who don't show up for court, but the vast majority do, more than 80% of asylum-seeking families. And the reason is because many of them really want asylum. Also, frankly, because they often have an ankle bracelet on their foot. And if they don't show up for court, they're going to be ordered deported in absentia, meaning though they didn't show up, and then ICE is going to come pick them up and return them to a country that they are afraid to return to. So they have a strong incentive to show up for court. In fact, in my experience, when people don't show up for court, it's as often as not because they didn't get the hearing notice, or they were confused about how, what they were supposed to do. When asylum seekers have an attorney, a legal representative, and that's something that we do at World Relief, 99% plus of those people show up for their court hearings.
Wow. Right. So, and I also think it's good because to know this as well, is in the headlines, we always see, migrants apprehended at the border and then detained. And I think just kind of in our American culture, we think that if you're ever apprehended, that word is used, and you're detained, you are a criminal. You have done something wrong. And so a lot of times when you're seeing those headlines, I would hope that we would start having this reactionary response that person is a criminal or someone here to cause us harm. That is just the word that is used to take someone in to custody while they're being processed.
That's right. I mean, it's worth mentioning, one of the most significant reasons that people request asylum or request refugee status overseas is because they're persecuted for their religion. And very often that religion that's getting them in trouble somewhere else in the world is Christianity. I mean, these are persecuted brothers and sisters in Christ in a significant number of cases. Not all by any means. There's political persecution, there's ethnic-focused persecution. But a lot of people who seek asylum are doing so because they were persecuted for their faith in Jesus overseas. And they get here, and in many cases, we put them into a jail-like detention facility for a couple of years before we decide that indeed, you did prove you are worthy of asylum.
Got it. Okay. So the last question I'm going to ask you is, how can the church enter into this space? How can the church serve asylum seekers, refugees?
Yeah, it's such an important question. 'Cause again, whatever you think about these policies, there are people showing up in communities across the United States who have been released for one reason or another, who are very vulnerable. They're not usually authorized to work. They got to provide for themselves. Sometimes they've got family to help, but it is a huge help when a church comes alongside them too. And that's something that we have done at World Relief in various parts of the country. There's other good Christian ministries doing that. At World Relief, we even have done that with some people who are not released, who are held in detention. We can go in and serve them in one of the detention centers outside of Seattle. And we're running church services there. I mean, we have church services, and I forget how many different languages, but some of those people are strong believers in Jesus when they get into that situation. Sometimes that's why they're asylum seekers in the first place. Others are not necessarily believers, but they're curious about who Jesus is. And, we never force that on anyone, but we have the opportunity to point people to what we believe in and what motivates us to welcome those who come as foreigners into the United States. And we think that's an opportunity for the church all over the United States.
Thank you, Matt. That is an opportunity for us. So I appreciate you and all of your knowledge in this space.
So glad to be here. Thanks for doing this, Bree.